The sunlight streamed through the stained-glass windows of St. George's Church, casting colourful patterns across the marble floor and illuminating the faces of London's finest society. A collective gasp echoed through the hallowed walls as Lord Thomas Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood shipping fortune, stepped away from his bride. Miss Eleanor Hartley stood frozen at the altar, her gloved hands trembling around her bouquet of white roses and lilies. The pearls adorning her ivory wedding gown seemed to dim as realization dawned upon her delicate features. "I cannot proceed with this union," Thomas announced, his voice carrying through the shocked silence. "I must speak the truth before God and these witnesses." He turned to Eleanor, not meeting her eyes. "I have made promises to another. Forgive me." Eleanor felt her world crumbling around her. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the pews like wildfire. Ladies hid their gossip behind ornate fans, while gentlemen cleared their throats uncomfortably. She could hear her mother's muffled sob from the front row, could feel her father's rage building beside her. "Thomas," she whispered, reaching for his sleeve, but he stepped further away, looking anywhere but at her face. "Please understand," he murmured, though his words were meant more for the crowd than for her. "My heart belongs elsewhere." The church doors opened, and Eleanor knew without turning who had arrived. Miss Victoria Pembroke entered with a triumphant smile, her ruby dress a scandalous choice for a morning wedding, her golden curls arranged artfully beneath her feathered hat. Thomas's eyes found hers immediately, and the devotion in his gaze was unmistakable. Eleanor's legs threatened to give way beneath her. 6 months of courtship, of walks in Hyde Park, of dances at Almack's, of whispered promises and gentle touches of gloved hands, all a charade. The humiliation burned more fiercely than the pain of lost love. "A shameful display," someone murmured from the pews. "Poor Miss Hartley," another voice added, dripping with a pity that felt like acid on Eleanor's skin. Her father stepped forward, his face crimson with rage. "Blackwood, you will answer for this outrage." But Thomas was already walking down the aisle toward Victoria, offering his arm to the woman who had clearly won his affections. The congregation erupted in scandalized conversation as Eleanor stood abandoned before the altar, her wedding veil suddenly feeling like a shroud. The vicar cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should adjourn to the vestry to—" "That will not be necessary." The deep voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. It silenced the church instantly. Heavy footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Eleanor did not need to turn to recognize the owner of that voice, but she did so nonetheless, her tear-filled eyes widening as the most feared man in London approached the altar. The Duke of Thornfield moved with predatory grace, his tall figure commanding attention in his impeccable black mourning coat. His reputation preceded him, widowed young, rumored to have driven his wife to an early grave, ruthless in business, merciless to his enemies, and completely immune to the charms of society's daughters. Alexander Everett, the 7th Duke of Thornfield, was not a man who attended weddings, yet here he stood, his penetrating grey eyes fixed upon Eleanor as he approached. The scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw, a souvenir from the Crimean War, seemed to deepen as he frowned. The congregation held its collective breath. Even Thomas had halted his retreat, turning to watch the Duke's approach with visible apprehension. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent church, "it appears you find yourself in need of a husband today." Eleanor could barely comprehend his words through her shock. She had met the Duke only twice, once at her coming-out ball 3 seasons ago, where he had watched from the shadows before departing early, and again at her aunt's literary salon last winter, where he had debated philosophy with the scholars present, but had hardly acknowledged her existence. Yet now his gaze held hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, though perhaps it should have been, but of something else entirely. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I find myself in need of a duchess," he continued, as though discussing the weather. "The circumstances seem advantageous for us both." Eleanor's father stepped forward. "Your Grace, while I appreciate your unusual offer, my daughter has just suffered a terrible shock. This is hardly the time." "On the contrary, Sir William," the Duke interrupted, never taking his eyes from Eleanor's face. "I would argue this is precisely the time. Your daughter faces public humiliation. I offer an immediate solution." He turned slightly toward the assembled guests. "Would society not agree that becoming a duchess rather surpasses becoming the wife of a merchant's son?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the church. The Duke of Thornfield was one of the wealthiest men in England, with extensive lands and investments that dwarfed the Blackwood shipping enterprise. Thomas's face had gone pale. I don't understand," Eleanor stammered, finding her voice at last. "You cannot possibly wish to marry me." The Duke's lips curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I assure you, Miss Hartley, I rarely say things I do not mean." He extended his gloved hand to her. "The choice is yours. Walk out of this church a jilted bride or depart as a duchess. What shall it be?" Eleanor's mind raced. The Duke was known to be cold, distant and unyielding, a man who had sworn never to remarry after his first wife's tragic death. Why would he offer marriage to her, especially in such a public manner? She was not from the highest circles of nobility, though her family was respectable and prosperous. She possessed neither extraordinary beauty nor significant dowry to tempt a man of his standing. Yet as she gazed into his unfathomable grey eyes, she saw something that gave her pause, not warmth precisely, but a steadiness, a promise perhaps. And in that moment, with the weight of 300 pairs of eyes upon her and the ruins of her future scattered at her feet, steadiness seemed like salvation. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I accept your proposal." A collective gasp filled the church once more. The Duke nodded once as though concluding a business transaction and offered his arm. "Vicar," he said, addressing the thoroughly bewildered clergyman, "I believe you have a ceremony to complete." But the banns haven't been read, Your Grace," the vicar protested weakly. "There are procedures, licenses." "I have a special license," the Duke replied, reaching into his coat and producing a document bearing the Archbishop's seal. "I took the liberty of securing it before my arrival." Another wave of whispers swept through the congregation. He had come prepared. This was no spontaneous rescue, but a calculated move. Eleanor felt a chill race down her spine, even as she placed her trembling hand on the Duke's offered arm. Thomas finally found his voice. "Thornfield, you cannot—" "I believe you relinquished any right to an opinion when you abandoned Miss Hartley at the altar, Blackwood," the Duke said coldly. "Remove yourself and your companion from my sight before I reconsider my customary restraint." Thomas blanched and retreated. Victoria Pembroke, for all her earlier triumph, now appeared distinctly uncomfortable under the Duke's glacial gaze. They slipped out of the church as the congregation watched in stunned silence. "Shall we proceed?" the Duke asked, turning back to Eleanor. She nodded, unable to form words, as he led her before the vicar. The ceremony passed in a blur, the familiar words now taking on an entirely different meaning as she pledged herself to this enigmatic stranger. His hand was warm and firm as it held hers, his responses clear and unwavering. When he placed a heavy gold signet ring upon her finger, his family crest emblazoned upon it in place of the diamond Thomas had chosen, the finality of what she had done struck her fully. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar declared, still looking somewhat perplexed by the turn of events. "Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." Eleanor held her breath as the Duke turned to her. His eyes searched hers for a moment before he leaned down and pressed his lips briefly to her forehead, a gesture more protective than passionate, but strangely reassuring nonetheless. "My Duchess," he said quietly, for her ears alone. Then he was leading her down the aisle, past the astonished faces of London's elite. Eleanor kept her head high, though her thoughts raced chaotically. She had entered the church as Miss Eleanor Hartley, expecting to leave as Mrs. Thomas Blackwood. Instead, she departed as Her Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield, on the arm of a man whose reputation made matrons clutch their pearls and gentlemen reach for their brandies. The Duke's carriage awaited outside, a magnificent vehicle of gleaming black with the Thornfield crest emblazoned on the door, drawn by 4 perfectly matched grey horses. He handed her in as the crowd poured out of the church to watch this extraordinary epilogue to what had already been the scandal of the season. "Thornfield House, James," the Duke instructed his coachman before settling across from Eleanor in the luxuriously appointed interior. As the carriage pulled away from the curb, Eleanor finally allowed herself to exhale. "Your Grace," she began. "Alexander," he corrected her. "You are my wife now. You may use my given name in private." "Alexander," she repeated, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. "I must ask, why would you do this? Why would you marry a woman you hardly know?" He regarded her with those unreadable grey eyes. "I have known you longer than you might imagine, Eleanor. I have observed you at various social functions over the years. You are intelligent, composed and discreet, qualities I value in a duchess. You've been watching me." The thought was unsettling, yet strangely flattering. "Assessing," he corrected. "I have been seeking a suitable wife for some time. Today's unfortunate circumstances merely accelerated my timetable." "So this was not some impulsive act of chivalry," Eleanor said, a curious disappointment settling in her chest. "I am not given to impulse," he replied, "nor to chivalry, as you will learn. This was a practical decision for us both." Eleanor smoothed her wedding gown, the one she had commissioned for another man. "What will be expected of me as your Duchess? You will manage my households, attend functions as required, and eventually provide an heir to the dukedom," he said matter-of-factly. "In return, you will want for nothing materially. You will have complete freedom to pursue your intellectual interests. Your aunt speaks highly of your literary endeavors." She started in surprise. "You've discussed me with my aunt?" A slight curl touched the corner of his mouth. "Lady Harrington has been advocating your merits to me for nearly a year. She will be most satisfied with today's outcome, if not the precise manner of its achievement." Eleanor's thoughts whirled. Her aunt had been matchmaking behind the scenes, pushing her toward the Duke of Thornfield, while she had been dreaming of a future with Thomas. How blind she had been. "And what of—" She hesitated, a blush warming her cheeks. "What of more personal matters between us?" The Duke's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, something that made Eleanor's heart beat a little faster. "That aspect of our marriage will develop naturally," he said quietly. "I will not rush you, especially given today's events. You have my word on that." The carriage turned onto a tree-lined avenue, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Thornfield House, a magnificent Portland stone mansion set back from the road behind imposing wrought-iron gates. As the carriage rolled up the gravelled drive, she saw the grand entrance with its Corinthian columns and the sweeping lawns that stretched to either side. "Welcome to your new home, Duchess," Alexander said as the carriage came to a halt. A line of servants had assembled on the steps to greet their new mistress. Eleanor took a deep breath as the footman opened the carriage door. Whatever the future held with this mysterious man who was now her husband, she would face it with dignity. She was no longer the abandoned bride, but the Duchess of Thornfield. And something told her that title would bring challenges and complications far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The Duke's hand at her elbow guided her up the steps, where the butler, an elderly man with a dignified bearing, bowed deeply. "Welcome, Your Grace. The household is honored by your arrival." "Thank you, Barrett," she replied, surprising both the butler and her husband with her knowledge of his name. She had always made it her business to learn the names of servants at the grand houses she visited, a habit her mother had encouraged as a mark of good breeding. "You have been prepared for my arrival?" she asked, puzzled. "His Grace sent word ahead while we were in the church," Barrett explained. "The Duchess's suite has been readied, and refreshments await in the blue drawing-room." Alexander led her into a grand entrance hall with a sweeping staircase and marble floors. Portraits of stern-faced Everetts looked down from the walls, generations of dukes and duchesses, watching their newest addition with painted eyes. "I imagine you would like some time to compose yourself," Alexander said as they reached the drawing-room. "Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, will show you to your chambers when you're ready. I have business to attend to, but I will join you for dinner at 7. "Thank you," Eleanor said, suddenly overwhelmed by the formality between them. They were strangers who had just vowed to spend their lives together. "I appreciate your consideration during this unusual circumstance." Something softened in his expression, so briefly she almost missed it. "Rest, Eleanor. Today has been trying for you. We will have time to become better acquainted in the days ahead." With a bow, he left her alone in the opulent room. Eleanor sank onto a blue damask sofa, finally allowing the full weight of the day's events to settle upon her. Tears threatened, but she blinked them away. She was a duchess now. She would not weep for a man who had humiliated her, nor would she regret the decision that had saved her from that humiliation. Instead, she would learn about the enigmatic man she had married, the Duke with the fearsome reputation and unexpectedly gentle touch. There was more to Alexander Everett than society knew. She was certain of it, and she had a lifetime to discover his secrets. The first week of marriage passed in a blur of introductions and adjustments. Eleanor met the household staff, familiarized herself with the sprawling mansion, and began the daunting task of understanding her new position in society. Alexander was frequently absent during the days, attending to business matters at his various properties and investments, but each evening they dined together in the formal dining room, making stilted conversation across a table that could seat 20. On the 7th day, as they sat through another such meal, Eleanor set down her fork with determination. "This won't do," she said firmly. Alexander looked up from his plate, one dark eyebrow raised in question. "I beg your pardon? Is the food not to your liking?" "The food is excellent, as always," she assured him. "It's this." She gestured to the vast expanse of table between them. "We cannot continue to dine like strangers attending a state banquet. How are we to become acquainted when we must practically shout to converse?" A flash of amusement crossed his face. "What would you suggest, Duchess? That we dine in the morning room at a reasonably sized table where we might actually see each other's expressions," she replied, "and that you call me Eleanor, not Duchess, when we are alone." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Eleanor. The morning room it shall be, beginning tomorrow." "Thank you, Alexander." She smiled. A small victory won. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly. "Oh, and what did you expect?" More tears, perhaps. More resentment at being thrust into this arrangement. His grey eyes searched hers. "You've adapted with remarkable composure." Eleanor considered her response carefully. "I was raised to believe that one must make the best of one's circumstances. And truthfully, while our marriage may have begun unusually, it offers me opportunities I might never have had otherwise. Such as the freedom you promised, to pursue my writing without societal constraints. As a duchess, I answer to no one but you, and you've already granted me that liberty." She hesitated before continuing. "Thomas would have expected me to set aside my frivolous scribblings, as he called them once we were wed." Alexander's expression darkened. "Blackwood is a fool on multiple accounts, it seems. Have you read any of my work?" she asked, curious. "I have," he admitted. "Your essay on the changing role of women in modern literature was particularly insightful. Your aunt showed it to me last winter." Eleanor flushed with pleasure. "You never mentioned it at her salon. I was not ready to reveal my interest in you at that time." His frank admission surprised her. "But I found your mind intriguing long before today's events." Their conversation was interrupted by Barrett, announcing the arrival of a visitor. "Lord Harrington requests an audience, Your Grace." Alexander frowned. "At this hour? Show him to the library. I'll join him shortly." As the butler withdrew, Eleanor rose from her seat. "My uncle's visit must be important. I should retire and leave you to your discussion." "No," Alexander said, surprising her. "Join us. This concerns you as well, I imagine." Eleanor followed him to the library, where her uncle, the Earl of Harrington, paced before the fireplace. He turned as they entered, his expression a mixture of relief and concern upon seeing Eleanor. "My dear girl," he said, stepping forward to take her hands, "your aunt and I have been beside ourselves with worry. When we received word of what transpired at the church, as you can see, Uncle, I am perfectly well," Eleanor assured him, squeezing his hands affectionately. "Better than well," the Earl remarked, glancing between her and Alexander. "Duchess, no less, though I must say, Thornfield, your method of acquiring a wife leaves much to be desired in terms of propriety. Would you have preferred I left her to public humiliation?" Alexander asked dryly, pouring brandy for himself and the Earl. "Proprieties must occasionally yield to practicalities." "Yes, well," Lord Harrington accepted the brandy. "The ton is in an uproar, naturally. Nothing like this has happened in living memory. Blackwood has fled to the continent with his mistress, and society is divided between condemning his callousness and marveling at your intervention." "And what does society say of me, Uncle?" Eleanor asked quietly. The Earl hesitated. "There are those who question your part in all this, my dear. They wonder if you somehow orchestrated the entire affair to secure a dukedom." Eleanor paled. "That's preposterous. How could anyone believe I would arrange my own abandonment?" "People will believe what entertains them most," Alexander said, his voice hard. "But such rumors will die quickly. I have seen to it." "How?" Eleanor asked. "I have made it known in certain influential circles that anyone repeating such slander against my Duchess will answer directly to me." His tone left no doubt that such a confrontation would be deeply unpleasant. Lord Harrington nodded approvingly. "Effective, if somewhat medieval. In any case, your aunt is hosting a small dinner party next week. She insists you both attend, your first public appearance as husband and wife." Eleanor glanced at Alexander uncertainly. "So soon?" "Better to face society directly than hide away and fuel speculation," he replied. "We shall attend." After Lord Harrington departed, Alexander walked Eleanor to the foot of the grand staircase leading to their separate chambers. "You should rest," he said, his voice gentler than she had yet heard it. "Tomorrow will be another day of adjustment." "Alexander," she said hesitantly, "may I ask you something personal?" He tensed almost imperceptibly, but nodded. "Your first marriage, was it also one of convenience rather than affection?" His expression closed immediately, the momentary warmth vanishing like morning mist. "That is a subject I do not discuss, not even with my wife. Good night, Eleanor." He turned away sharply, leaving her standing alone at the bottom of the staircase, regretting her intrusion into what was clearly still a painful wound. She had touched upon the very mystery that made the Duke of Thornfield such a figure of speculation in society. His brief, tragic first marriage to Lady Caroline Montague, which had ended with her death under circumstances that had never been fully explained to the public. As she climbed the stairs to her chambers, Eleanor resolved to be more careful in the future. A new husband was offering her protection, position, and certain freedoms, but clearly not his confidence, at least not yet. Patience would be required if she ever hoped to understand the complex man she had married. The night of Lady Harrington's dinner party arrived all too quickly. Eleanor stood before her mirror as her new lady's maid Simpson arranged her hair in an elegant style befitting a duchess. She had chosen a gown of deep, sapphire blue silk, the first of many new garments Alexander had commissioned for her from London's finest modistes, without her even having to ask. The Thornfield diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, their weight still unfamiliar. "You look magnificent, Your Grace," Simpson said, stepping back to admire her work. "Thank you, Simpson," Eleanor replied, trying to calm the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Tonight would be her first public appearance as Duchess of Thornfield. The eyes of society would be examining her every move, judging whether she was worthy of the unexpected elevation in status. A knock at the door announced Alexander's arrival to escort her. Eleanor's breath caught as he entered her chamber, resplendent in formal evening attire. His commanding presence seemed enhanced by the elegant black tailcoat and crisp white linen. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident approval. "As do you," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks at his directness. He offered his arm, and together they descended the grand staircase to where the Thornfield carriage awaited. As they travelled through London's fashionable streets, Eleanor rehearsed in her mind how she would conduct herself. She must be dignified yet warm, confident yet modest, a duchess worthy of the Thornfield name regardless of how she had come to bear it. "You're anxious," Alexander observed, watching her gloved fingers tap lightly against the carriage seat. "I'm concerned about how I will be received," she admitted. "I've never been the focus of scandal before." "You are no longer Miss Eleanor Hartley, who must worry about society's approval," he reminded her. "You are the Duchess of Thornfield. Society will adjust its expectations accordingly." "Is it really that simple?" she asked skeptically. "For a duke and duchess?" "Yes." His confidence was unwavering. "Remember, Eleanor, very few in the ton would dare snub you openly now, regardless of their private opinions. They value their connections to Thornfield too highly." "That sounds rather mercenary," she observed. "It is the way of our world," he replied. "I harbor no illusions about the nature of social allegiances." "Neither should you." When they arrived at her aunt and uncle's townhouse, Eleanor steeled herself for the evening ahead. Alexander's hand at the small of her back provided unexpected reassurance as they were announced to the assembled guests. His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield. A hush fell over the gathering as all eyes turned to examine the couple. Eleanor maintained a serene expression as she and Alexander moved through the room greeting their hosts. Lady Harrington embraced her warmly, whispering, "You've done magnificently, my dear. Look at how they all envy you now." Eleanor was introduced to those guests she did not already know, aware of the intense scrutiny behind each polite smile and curtsy. Alexander remained constantly at her side, his imposing presence a shield against any potential slight. When dinner was announced, he escorted her to the place of honor at Lord Harrington's right hand, while he sat at Lady Harrington's right, directly across from Eleanor. Throughout the meal, Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares. Lady Winthrop, a notorious gossip whose daughter had once set her cap for Thomas Blackwood, leaned forward with barely concealed eagerness. "I must say, Your Grace, you have managed a most remarkable transition in circumstances," she said, her sweet tone belying the barb beneath. "One might almost call it providential. How quickly you secured an even more advantageous match." A tense silence fell around the table. Eleanor was aware of Alexander's gaze fixed intently upon her, watching how she would handle this first direct challenge. She smiled pleasantly. "Indeed, Lady Winthrop, Providence works in unexpected ways. I consider myself most fortunate in my husband." She turned her gaze to Alexander, allowing genuine warmth to enter her expression. "His Grace has shown me what true honor looks like in a gentleman." The implied comparison to Thomas was unmistakable. A ripple of appreciation ran through the guests, and even Lady Winthrop had the grace to look chastened. Alexander's eyes held hers for a long moment, and for the first time, Eleanor saw open approval there. "The fortune is mutual, I assure you," he replied, raising his wineglass in a subtle salute to her. The moment was broken by Lord Pemberton, a business associate of the Duke's. "Thornfield, what do you make of this railway expansion to the north? A sound investment in your view?" As the conversation turned to business and politics, Eleanor exchanged pleasantries with the ladies around her. She noticed with satisfaction that the initial wariness had largely dissipated. By the time the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars, she had successfully navigated the first hurdle of her new social position. In the drawing room, her aunt drew her aside. "You handled Lady Winthrop perfectly, my dear." Thornfield looked quite proud. "Did he?" Eleanor asked, unable to hide her pleasure at the observation. Lady Harrington studied her niece carefully. "You know, when I first suggested you to him as a potential duchess, I worried about your happiness. Alexander is not an easy man. Brilliant and honorable, yes, but wounded in ways few understand. Yet I begin to think you might be precisely what he needs." "He suggested me?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "Before Thomas even jilted me." "My dear, why do you think he had a special license already prepared?" Her aunt smiled knowingly. "He had been considering you for some time. Thomas's disgraceful behavior merely accelerated his timetable." "But why me specifically?" Eleanor pressed. "Surely there were more advantageous matches available to him, daughters of dukes or even foreign princesses." "Alexander has never cared for advantage in that sense. He has more than enough wealth and power already." Lady Harrington patted Eleanor's hand. "What he saw in you, I believe, was a kindred spirit, someone with intelligence and character, who would not wilt under the weight of his reputation." Eleanor considered this new information as the gentlemen rejoined them. Alexander immediately sought her out, offering his arm to lead her to the pianoforte where she was requested to play. As her fingers moved over the keys, she was acutely aware of his presence behind her, watching with an intensity she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. Later, as their carriage rolled through the darkened London streets toward Thornfield House, Eleanor found herself studying her husband's profile in the dim light. "You knew," she said finally, "before Thomas left me at the altar. You were already planning to propose." He turned to face her, neither confirming nor denying her assertion. "Does that trouble you?" "I'm not certain," she admitted. "It's rather disconcerting to discover one has been selected without one's knowledge." "Would you have preferred I approached you directly while you were engaged to another man?" he asked reasonably. "Of course not, but—" She paused, trying to articulate her confusion. "I suppose I wonder why you didn't seek me out before Thomas did. If you had been considering me for so long." Alexander's expression grew distant. "After Caroline died, I swore I would never marry again. It took several years to reconsider that position, and by then you were already being courted by Blackwood." His jaw tightened. "I would not interfere with what appeared to be a love match until it became clear it was anything but." "So you came to the church that day, prepared for the possibility that Blackwood might prove himself unworthy of you, yes?" He met her gaze directly. "I had heard rumors of his entanglement with Miss Pembroke. When my sources confirmed he planned to jilt you, I acted accordingly." Eleanor absorbed this revelation. "You saved me from public ruin." "I secured a duchess I had long determined would be suitable," he corrected, though not unkindly. "Your rescue was a fortunate coincidence of interests." "Always the pragmatist," she observed, a small smile playing at her lips despite herself. "Always," he agreed. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he added more softly, "though in this instance, pragmatism aligned with other considerations." "What considerations?" she asked, her heart suddenly beating faster. But they had arrived at Thornfield House, and the moment for such revelations had passed. Alexander helped her from the carriage and escorted her inside, where Barrett informed them that a package had arrived for the Duchess from the Hartley residence, her personal belongings, sent by her parents. "Have them taken to her Grace's chambers," Alexander instructed. As they reached the top of the staircase where they would part ways for the night, Eleanor impulsively placed her hand on Alexander's arm. "Thank you for this evening, for your support in facing society." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "You required no support, Eleanor. You conducted yourself perfectly." He hesitated, then gently covered her hand with his own. "Good night, Duchess." "Good night, Duke," she replied with a small smile, watching as he disappeared down the corridor toward his own chambers, wondering what other secrets lay beneath his carefully controlled exterior. The weeks that followed saw Eleanor settling more comfortably into her role as Duchess of Thornfield. She restructured the household routine, began charitable work with several worthy institutions, and established a small literary salon that quickly became one of the most coveted invitations in London. Alexander observed these developments with quiet approval, occasionally joining her salon discussions when notable academics or authors were present. Their relationship had reached a comfortable plateau, respectful, cordial, even warm at times, but still marked by the careful distance Alexander maintained. They dined together each evening in the morning room, as Eleanor had requested, and these private conversations gradually revealed more of his character. She discovered his dry wit, his formidable intellect, and his surprising knowledge of literature and art. Yet whenever she approached more personal topics, his childhood, his time in the Crimea, or anything related to his first marriage, he would retreat behind his ducal reserve. One evening in late autumn, As rain lashed against the windows of Thornfield House, Eleanor sat in her private sitting room adjoining her bedchamber, working on her latest essay by lamplight. A knock at the door surprised her. Alexander rarely ventured to her private chambers. "Enter," she called, setting aside her papers. Alexander stood in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Forgive the intrusion. Barrett informed me you hadn't retired yet. Is something wrong?" she asked, rising to her feet. "I've received news that makes it necessary for us to depart for Thornfield Court, my country estate in Derbyshire, at first light." He stepped into the room, his tall frame dominating the intimate space. "My steward reports a dispute with tenant farmers that requires my personal attention." "Of course," Eleanor said, already mentally preparing for the journey. "I'll have Simpson begin packing immediately." Alexander hesitated. "The weather is poor, and the roads will be difficult. You need not accompany me, if you prefer to remain in London." "I am your Duchess," she replied simply. "My place is at your side, especially when your tenants are concerned. They should know who I am." Something like satisfaction flashed in his eyes. "Very well, we leave at dawn." True to his word, they departed London as the first pale light of morning broke through the clouds. Their journey northward was arduous, the roads muddied by autumn rains, but Eleanor found herself enjoying the changing landscape as they left the city behind. Alexander proved a knowledgeable companion, pointing out properties and landmarks of interest, explaining the history of various regions they passed through. By the time they reached Derbyshire 3 days later, Eleanor felt she had learned more about her husband during their journey than in all the weeks preceding it. The strain of travel had somehow loosened his reserve, allowing glimpses of the man beneath the ducal mantle. Thornfield Court took her breath away when it first came into view, a magnificent Elizabethan manor house of weathered stone and leaded glass windows, surrounded by ancient oaks and formal gardens that gave way to wilder parkland beyond. Unlike the imposing grandeur of his London residence, this ancestral seat possessed a timeless beauty that spoke of generations of history. "It's beautiful," she breathed as their carriage rolled up the long drive. "This is the true heart of Thornfield," Alexander told her, a note of genuine warmth in his voice she had rarely heard before. "London is necessary for business and politics, but this is home." Eleanor understood immediately why he felt that way. As they entered the grand hall with its hammer-beam ceiling and massive stone fireplace, she sensed the weight of heritage and belonging that permeated the ancient walls. This was not merely a house, but a legacy, one that now included her. Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper who had served at Thornfield Court for over 30 years, greeted them with dignified excitement. "Your Grace, it does our hearts good to see you." Thornfield Court took her breath away when it first came into view, a magnificent Elizabethan manor house of weathered stone and leaded glass windows, surrounded by ancient oaks and formal gardens that gave way to wilder parkland beyond. Unlike the imposing grandeur of his London residence, this ancestral seat possessed a timeless beauty that spoke of generations of history. "It's beautiful," she breathed as their carriage rolled up the long drive. "This is the true heart of Thornfield," Alexander told her, a note of genuine warmth in his voice she had rarely heard before. "London is necessary for business and politics, but this is home." Eleanor understood immediately why he felt that way. As they entered the grand hall with its hammer-beam ceiling and massive stone fireplace, she sensed the weight of heritage and belonging that permeated the ancient walls. This was not merely a house, but a legacy, one that now included her. Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper who had served at Thornfield Court for over 30 years, greeted them with dignified excitement. "Your Grace, it does our hearts good to see you home again, and to meet her Grace at last." She curtsied deeply to Eleanor. "We've prepared the Duchess's suite in the East Wing, with views of the Rose Garden. Though the blooms are past their prime this late in the season, I think you'll find the prospect pleasing nonetheless." "Thank you, Mrs. Hadley," Eleanor replied warmly. "I look forward to seeing the gardens in all seasons." A flicker of approval passed over the housekeeper's face at this suggestion that the Duchess intended to spend significant time at the country estate. "The staff is assembled in the servants' hall whenever you wish to meet them, Your Grace. Now would be appropriate," Alexander said, "before we address the tenant issue." The introduction to the household staff proceeded smoothly, Eleanor making a point to speak individually with each person, from the under-gardeners to the kitchen maids. She had learned from her mother that a well-run household depended on mutual respect between the family and those who served them. Afterward, Alexander led her to the estate office, where his steward, Mr. Winters, waited with several weather-worn men in sturdy working clothes, representatives of the tenant farmers whose dispute had brought them to Derbyshire. "Your Grace," one of the men began hesitantly, twisting his cap in his hands, "we meant no disrespect in bringing this matter to your attention. It's just that the new irrigation system Mr. Winters proposed would flood the lower fields where we grow the winter wheat. Eleanor watched as Alexander listened carefully to each man's concerns, asking pertinent questions and examining maps of the estate lands. She was struck by the contrast between his fearsome reputation in London society and the patient, fair-minded lord she observed now. These men clearly respected him, but they did not fear him as the ton did. "Gentlemen," Alexander said finally, "I believe we can modify the irrigation plan to protect your winter crops while still achieving the improvements needed for the eastern pastures. Mr. Winters will work with you to revise the scheme. I'll review the new plans in 3 days' time." The tenant farmers departed visibly relieved, and Mr. Winters lingered to discuss several other estate matters. Eleanor excused herself, sensing that her presence was not required for these discussions. She decided to explore her new home, wandering through grand reception rooms and intimate family spaces, each filled with treasures accumulated over centuries, portraits, rare books, exotic artifacts from far-flung travels. In the west wing, she discovered a locked door that piqued her curiosity. As she stood contemplating it, Mrs. Hadley appeared silently at her side. "Those were Lady Caroline's private rooms, Your Grace," the housekeeper explained gently. "His Grace ordered them closed after her passing." "I see," Eleanor said, stepping back from the door. "Thank you for telling me." "If you don't mind my saying so, Your Grace," Mrs. Hadley continued carefully, "it does our hearts good to see His Grace married again. After Lady Caroline, well, we feared he would always remain alone." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how to respond. "Mrs. Hadley, I wonder, could you tell me something of the previous Duchess? I know so little of her." The housekeeper's face grew solemn. "It's not my place to speak of such matters, Your Grace, but perhaps," she glanced around to ensure they were truly alone, "perhaps you should visit the family chapel. Lady Caroline lies there, and sometimes understanding the past helps with the present." Eleanor took this advice, finding her way through the gardens to the small stone chapel that had served the Everett family for generations. Inside, the air was cool and still, dust motes dancing in the colored light that filtered through stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes. Along the walls, memorial plaques and statues commemorated Everett's dating back to Tudor times. Near the altar, she found a newer memorial, a white marble effigy of a young woman in repose, her stone features serene in eternal sleep. The inscription read simply, "Lady Caroline Everett, Duchess of Thornfield, beloved wife, 1830–1853. Only 23 when she died, barely older than Eleanor herself." She studied the marble face, searching for clues to the woman who had preceded her as Alexander's wife. The sculpture showed a delicate beauty, with fine features and curls arranged artfully around her face. Unlike the stern expressions on the older Everett memorials, Lady Caroline's effigy had been carved with a gentle smile touching her lips. "She was beautiful," Alexander's voice came from behind her. Eleanor turned, startled to find her husband standing in the chapel doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude upon private grief." "You're my wife," he said, approaching slowly. "You have a right to know something of your predecessor." He stood beside Eleanor, looking down at the marble figure. "Caroline was the daughter of the Marquis of Westmoreland. We married when she was 20, I 28. It was considered an excellent match." "Did you love her?" Eleanor asked softly. A shadow crossed his face. "I believed I did. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a duchess should be, but I did not know her, not truly, not until it was too late." "What happened to her?" Eleanor ventured, uncertain if she was overstepping. Alexander was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and controlled, but Eleanor could sense the pain beneath it. "Caroline suffered from melancholia, what the doctors now call severe depression. She concealed it well during our courtship, but after our marriage she began to withdraw. There were days when she could not leave her bed, when she would weep for hours without explanation." His fingers brushed lightly over the marble hand of the effigy. "I tried everything, the finest physicians, visits to spa towns, even a journey to Italy for the sun and change of scenery. Nothing helped for long." "That must have been terribly difficult for you both," Eleanor said gently. "The worst was that I could not understand her suffering. I demanded explanations she could not give, grew frustrated when treatments failed." His voice tightened with self-recrimination. "I was not patient enough, not kind enough. I was away in London on business when—" He stopped abruptly. "When she died," Eleanor prompted softly. Alexander's jaw clenched. "When she walked into the lake on the east side of the property one winter morning. A gardener found her too late." He turned away from the effigy, his expression hardening. "Society whispered that I had driven her to it with coldness or cruelty, that I was a monster who had broken a fragile woman." Eleanor reached out impulsively, laying her hand on his arm. You were young, facing something you couldn't understand. No one could hold you responsible for her illness. I held myself responsible, he said simply. I still do. The raw honesty of his admission touched Eleanor deeply. For the first time, she truly saw past the imposing Duke of Thornfield to the man beneath, a man who had carried this burden of guilt and grief for years, allowing it to shape how the world perceived him, rather than defending himself against society's cruel speculation. Is that why you never remarried? She asked. Until me? Partly, he acknowledged, and partly because I feared a repetition, that I lacked whatever quality was needed to bring happiness to a wife. He met her eyes directly. You should know, Eleanor, that this is why our marriage must be one of mutual respect and appropriate distance. I will not risk causing another woman the pain Caroline suffered. Alexander, she said gently, you cannot protect me by keeping me at arm's length. Whatever arrangement we have, it must be built on trust and honesty, not fear. Something shifted in his expression, a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. You are unlike any woman I have known, he said quietly. I should hope so, she replied with a small smile, as you have married me rather than any of those other women. The hint of a smile touched his lips in response, a rare sight that transformed his austere features. Indeed, he offered her his arm. Shall we return to the house? I believe Mrs. Hadley has planned a special dinner to welcome you. As they walked back through the gardens, a comfortable silence between them, Eleanor felt a subtle shift in their relationship. Alexander had shared his deepest wound with her, and in doing so, had taken the first step toward true intimacy. She would need patience and care to help him heal fully, but for the first time since their unconventional wedding, she began to hope that their marriage might eventually become more than a practical arrangement. The days at Thornfield Court fell into a pleasant rhythm. While Alexander attended to estate business in the mornings, Eleanor familiarized herself with the household management and began visiting tenant families. In the afternoons, they often rode together across the extensive property, Alexander pointing out boundaries and features of the land that had been in his family for centuries. You've won over the tenants remarkably quickly, he observed one crisp afternoon as they cantered across an open field. Mrs. Winters tells me they've never seen such interest from the big house in their welfare. Eleanor guided her mare alongside his stallion. They're good people, their concerns are legitimate, and addressing them benefits the estate as much as the families. You sound like a born duchess, he remarked with approval. Hardly, she laughed. I'm learning as I go. But I was raised to believe that privilege carries responsibility, not just entitlement. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. My father would have agreed with you. He was stern but fair with the tenants. After his death, when I was fighting in the Crimea, some matters were neglected. I've been working to restore that balance since my return. Is that where you received your scar? She asked, glancing at the mark that ran from temple to jaw. Yes, he replied, unconsciously touching the mark. At the Battle of Balaclava, a Russian saber came rather too close for comfort. You were fortunate. More than you know, he said grimly. Many good men did not return at all. That evening after dinner, as they sat in the library before a crackling fire, Eleanor found the courage to ask about another mystery. Alexander, there's something I've been wondering about. He looked up from his book, one eyebrow raised in question. That day at the church, she began, when Thomas left me. You arrived so quickly, with a special license already prepared, yet you say you had not planned to propose while I was engaged to another man. Alexander closed his book slowly. You're asking how I reconcile those two facts. Yes, she said simply. He considered her for a long moment before answering. 3 days before your wedding, I received information that Blackwood was planning to humiliate you publicly. My sources were quite specific about his intentions. Your sources? Eleanor repeated, puzzled. I maintain connections with certain individuals who provide information that might otherwise be difficult to obtain, he said carefully. In this case, one such person overheard Blackwood boasting of his plan while intoxicated at his club. Eleanor felt sick at the thought of Thomas discussing her humiliation so callously. So you knew he would abandon me at the altar. I knew it was his intention. Yes, Alexander's expression hardened. I considered warning you privately, but I had no proof beyond hearsay. You might not have believed me, or worse, might have thought I was attempting to interfere with your marriage for my own purposes. So instead, you prepared to rescue me publicly if his plan came to fruition, she concluded. I obtained the special license and attended the ceremony, prepared for either outcome, he confirmed. If Blackwood had fulfilled his obligation to you, I would have departed quietly. When he revealed his true character, I acted accordingly. Eleanor shook her head in wonder. You risk significant embarrassment for yourself if your intervention proved unnecessary. A small risk compared to what you faced, he replied with a shrug. In any case, I was reasonably confident in my information. And if I had refused your offer at the altar? She asked, curious. A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. I confess, that possibility had not occurred to me. The alternatives before you were rather limited at that moment. True enough, she acknowledged with a small smile, though I might still have chosen to walk out alone rather than marry a stranger. Would you make the same choice again, knowing what you know now? He asked, his tone suddenly serious. Eleanor considered the question carefully. In the weeks since their marriage, she had come to respect Alexander deeply. She admired his intelligence, his sense of duty, the careful consideration he gave to all matters under his authority. And yes, she was drawn to him in ways she had never experienced with Thomas, a quiet, steady pull that grew stronger with each genuine moment they shared. Yes, she said finally, I would, though perhaps for different reasons than I had then. Something changed in Alexander's expression, a softening around his eyes, a relaxing of the ever-present tension in his shoulders. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his touch warm and certain. I'm glad to hear it, he said quietly. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed in her chamber, a knock came at her door. Simpson had already been dismissed for the evening, so she wrapped her dressing gown more securely around herself before calling, Enter. Alexander stood in the doorway, still fully dressed, though he had removed his cravat and collar. Forgive the intrusion at this hour, he said, his voice sounding less certain than usual. There is something I wish to give you. He stepped into the room, producing a small leather box from his pocket. This belonged to my mother, he explained, opening the box to reveal a pendant, a single perfect pearl suspended from a fine gold chain, surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the lamplight. It was her favorite piece, modest though it may be compared to the Thornfield diamonds. Eleanor touched the pearl gently. It's beautiful. She was not a duchess by birth, but the daughter of a country baronet, Alexander continued. My father scandalized society by choosing her over more advantageous matches, but they were happy, truly happy for all 20 years of their marriage. He lifted the necklace from its box. I would like you to have this. Alexander, I'm honored, but she hesitated. Are you certain? This is a deeply personal memento. That is precisely why I wish you to have it, he said. It should be worn, not hidden away in a vault. Would you allow me? At her nod, he moved behind her. Eleanor lifted her hair as he draped the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin as he fastened the clasp. The brief contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. She turned to face him, suddenly aware of their proximity and her state of undress. The pendant rested just below her collarbone, warm against her skin. Thank you, she said softly. I shall treasure it. Alexander's gaze held hers, and for a breathless moment, Eleanor thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and pressed his lips gently to her knuckles, a gesture of courtly restraint that nonetheless caused her heart to race. Good night, Eleanor, he murmured. Good night, she whispered as he withdrew, closing the door quietly behind him. Eleanor touched the pearl pendant, a smile curving her lips. The gift represented far more than a family heirloom. It was a token of trust, a sign that Alexander was beginning to see her not merely as a convenient duchess, but as a woman he valued. The wall he had built around himself since Caroline's death was slowly crumbling, and Eleanor found herself increasingly determined to help dismantle it completely. Their idyll at Thornfield Court was interrupted a week later by the arrival of an express letter from London. Alexander read it with a deepening frown before handing it to Eleanor. Thomas Blackwood has returned to London, he explained as she scanned the missive from her uncle. Without Miss Pembroke, it seems, he is spreading vicious rumours about you, claiming you conspired with me before the wedding to arrange the very scene that occurred. Eleanor paled. That's absurd. How could anyone believe such a thing? People will believe what suits their prejudices, Alexander said grimly. Blackwood has friends in certain circles who are all too willing to repeat his slander. What does he hope to gain by this? She wondered. Redemption in the eyes of society at your expense. Alexander's expression had hardened to granite. He portrays himself as the victim of a scheming woman and a calculating duke. We must return to London immediately, Eleanor declared, rising from her chair. I will not hide in the country while he tarnishes my reputation, and yours. Alexander studied her with evident approval. My thoughts exactly. We leave tomorrow, at first light. The journey back to London was accomplished in record time, despite deteriorating weather conditions. They arrived at Thornfield House to find several urgent messages waiting. invitations from allies, hoping to show their support publicly, and thinly veiled inquiries from others seeking confirmation or denial of the rumors. "We will attend Lady Marsden's ball tomorrow evening," Alexander decided, as they sorted through the correspondence in his study. "Blackwood is certain to be there, and a direct confrontation will be more effective than written denials." Eleanor nodded, though anxiety fluttered in her chest at the prospect of facing Thomas again and the hostile scrutiny of a divided society. "What shall I wear? It must be something befitting my station, yet not so ostentatious as to appear I'm overcompensating." "The midnight blue silk," Alexander suggested immediately, "with the Thornfield sapphires. You will outshine every woman present without appearing to try." His confident assessment brought a smile to her lips, despite her concerns. "Very well, the midnight blue it shall be." The following evening, as Eleanor descended the staircase in the gown Alexander had suggested, she found her husband waiting in the entrance hall. His sharp intake of breath as he looked up at her provided all the reassurance she needed about her appearance. "You are magnificent," he said simply, offering his arm. "As are you," she replied truthfully. Alexander in formal evening attire was a commanding sight, the perfect complement to her own carefully chosen ensemble. The Thornfield carriage delivered them to Lady Marsden's townhouse at the fashionable hour of 10 o'clock. As they were announced at the entrance to the ballroom, a momentary hush fell over the assembled guests before conversation resumed with increased intensity. "Courage, Duchess," Alexander murmured for her ears alone. "Remember who you are." They moved through the crowd with deliberate grace, accepting greetings from friends and allies, acknowledging even those who had clearly chosen Blackwood's side in the unfolding scandal. Eleanor maintained a serene expression throughout, though her heart pounded with tension as she scanned the room for Thomas. She spotted him finally, surrounded by a group of young bucks who hung on his every word. He faltered mid-sentence when he saw her, his face draining of color before he recovered himself with a sneer. "Ignore him for now," Alexander advised quietly. "Let him come to us. The first dance is about to begin. It will be a waltz, and we shall take the floor." As the orchestra struck up the opening bars, Alexander led Eleanor to the center of the ballroom. Other couples moved to join them, but a subtle gesture from the Duke kept a respectful distance between them and the Thornfields. As Alexander's hand settled at her waist and he guided her into the first steps of the waltz, Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them. "They're all watching us," she whispered. "Then let us give them something worth watching," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers as he executed a perfect turn that sent her midnight blue skirts swirling around them. "You dance beautifully, Duchess." "As do you, Duke," she returned, allowing herself to relax into his confident lead. They moved together with surprising harmony, as though they had danced as partners for years rather than this being their first waltz. Alexander guided her through the steps with a grace that belied his imposing stature, and Eleanor followed his lead instinctively, her body responding to the subtle pressure of his hand at her waist, the gentle guidance of his other hand clasping hers. When the music ended, applause rippled through the ballroom, slightly warmer than mere politeness required. Alexander bowed to Eleanor. She curtsied in return, and they moved toward the edge of the dance floor where Lady Marsden awaited them. "Your Grace," their hostess said, addressing Alexander but looking at Eleanor with approval, "you and your Duchess have created quite a stir this evening. Such a handsome couple. It quite put certain rumors to rest just to see you together." "Your support is appreciated, Lady Marsden," Alexander replied smoothly, "though I find it regrettable that malicious gossip should require refutation at all." "Yes, well," the older woman sniffed, "some people will say anything to salvage their own reputations after behaving abominably." She patted Eleanor's arm encouragingly. "My dear, you have handled this entire situation with admirable dignity. I always thought that Blackwood fellow wasn't good enough for you." As Lady Marsden moved away to greet other guests, Eleanor spotted Thomas approaching, a determined expression on his face. Alexander noticed him too, his posture subtly shifting to place himself slightly in front of Eleanor, protective without being obvious about it. "Your Grace," Thomas said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "And, Eleanor, how domestic you look together. One would almost believe it a love match." "Blackwood," Alexander acknowledged coldly. "I'm surprised you show your face in decent society after your disgraceful behavior." Thomas's smile was brittle. "My behavior? I merely followed my heart, as any honest man would. Better that than participate in a calculated scheme to elevate a merchant's daughter to a dukedom." Eleanor felt anger rise within her, not just at the insult to herself, but at the implication that Alexander had somehow been manipulated. Before her husband could respond, she stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Blackwood, your attempt to rewrite history is as transparent as it is pathetic." She met his gaze directly, letting him see the contempt in her eyes. "You abandoned me at the altar for another woman, only to be abandoned yourself when she realized your true character. Now you spread lies to salvage your wounded pride." Thomas flushed darkly. "You deny that you and Thornfield planned my humiliation? That this convenient marriage was arranged beforehand?" "I deny it categorically," Eleanor replied, "but I will not deny that I have found more honor, integrity, and kindness in my husband in these few weeks than I ever experienced during our entire courtship." Alexander placed his hand at the small of her back, a gesture of support that gave her strength to continue. "The truth, Mr. Blackwood, is that you were never worthy of the love I foolishly gave you. His Grace merely recognized what you failed to value." She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "In the end, your cruelty proved the greatest kindness anyone has ever done me." A ripple of appreciative murmurs spread through the growing audience around them. Thomas looked from Eleanor to Alexander, his expression ugly with thwarted rage. "This isn't over," he hissed, low enough that only they could hear. "On the contrary," Alexander replied with dangerous calm, "it is entirely over. You will cease spreading falsehoods about the Duchess of Thornfield immediately, or you will face consequences beyond your imagining. Am I perfectly clear?" The implicit threat in his tone caused Thomas to take an involuntary step back. Without another word, he turned and pushed his way through the crowd, his face mottled with humiliation. As he departed, Lady Harrington appeared at Eleanor's side. "Magnificent, my dear," she whispered. "Absolutely magnificent. You've won this round decisively." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of dances, conversations, and subtle social maneuvering. Eleanor was gratified to note that most of the ton appeared to be aligning themselves with the Thornfields rather than with Thomas, partly out of respect for the Duke's power and position, no doubt, but also, she hoped, because they recognized the truth when they heard it. It was well past midnight when Alexander suggested they depart. As their carriage rolled toward Thornfield House, Eleanor leaned back against the cushioned seat, physical and emotional exhaustion finally claiming her. "You were superb tonight," Alexander said, studying her in the dim light of the carriage lanterns. "I could not have asked for a more formidable duchess." "We were formidable together," she corrected with a tired smile. "Thank you for your support." "Support?" He shook his head slightly. "Eleanor, you needed no support. You demolished Blackwood with nothing but truth and dignity. Nevertheless, knowing you stood beside me gave me courage." She met his gaze directly. "We make a good team, I think." "Indeed we do," he agreed softly. Something in his tone made Eleanor's heart beat faster. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that took her breath away. The carriage jolted to a stop before Thornfield House, breaking the moment. Alexander helped Eleanor descend, his hand lingering on hers a fraction longer than necessary. As they entered the house, Barrett informed them that an urgent message had arrived from the Duke's solicitor. "It can wait until morning," Alexander decided, glancing at Eleanor's weary face. "It's been a long evening." He escorted her to the foot of the grand staircase, as had become their custom. But tonight, instead of their usual formal parting, Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm, an intimate gesture that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "Sleep well." "Good night, Alexander," she replied, unable to look away from his intense gaze. As she ascended the stairs, she felt his eyes following her, and for the first time since their wedding, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that their marriage of convenience might be transforming into something far more meaningful than either of them had anticipated. The message from Alexander's solicitor, as it turned out, concerned a disturbing development. Thomas Blackwood, finding himself increasingly ostracized in society and facing financial difficulties after his abandoned European travels, had begun making specific allegations about improprieties in the Thornfield business dealings. "He claims to have evidence of fraud in your East India investments," Eleanor said, reading the solicitor's letter at breakfast the following morning. "But how could he possibly have access to your business records?" Alexander's expression was grim. "He couldn't, unless he had help from someone within my organization, someone I trusted, a traitor in your midst." Eleanor set down the letter, troubled by the implications. "Who would betray you in such a manner?" "I have my suspicions," he replied. "Blackwood has been seen in the company of my former secretary, James Harwood, a man I dismissed last year for certain irregularities in his conduct. What will you do?" "Confront the problem directly." Alexander folded the letter with decisive movements. I've arranged to meet with my solicitor and banker this afternoon. I would appreciate your company if you're willing. Eleanor was surprised by the request. I know little of business matters, Alexander. How could I be of help? You have excellent judgment and a keen eye for deception, he said simply. Qualities I value greatly at present. The meeting took place in the elegant offices of Thornfield's long-time solicitor, Mr. Graves, a sharp-eyed man of 60, with a reputation for absolute discretion. As they reviewed account ledgers and correspondence, Eleanor observed the interactions between Alexander and his advisers, noting the deep respect they clearly held for him. Your Grace, Mr. Graves said finally, having examined all the documentation, I can state with complete certainty that these allegations are groundless. Your investments in the East India Company are entirely legitimate and properly recorded. As I expected, Alexander nodded, but Blackwood is spreading specific claims, details he could only have obtained from someone with inside knowledge of our operations. Harwood, suggested Mr. Pemberton, Alexander's banker. The man was with you for 3 years. He had access to sensitive information. What he lacks is context, Alexander replied thoughtfully. He knows enough to craft plausible lies, but not enough to make them withstand serious scrutiny. Eleanor, who had been quietly examining a particular ledger, spoke up. There's something odd here. She indicated an entry from the previous year. This investment was made the day after you dismissed Mr. Harwood, according to the date. If he's using older information to fabricate his claims, then we have a clear way to prove his ignorance, Alexander finished, a look of approval in his eyes. Excellent observation, Duchess. With this realization, a strategy quickly took shape. Alexander would request a formal retraction from Thomas, presenting evidence that proved the allegations false. If Thomas refused, legal action would follow, a prospect that would certainly destroy what remained of the Blackwood family's standing and finances. I believe Blackwood will withdraw his claims when confronted with the facts, Mr. Graves opined. He's a coward at heart, and his family cannot afford a protracted legal battle against Thornfield. As they departed the solicitor's offices, Alexander placed Eleanor's hand on his arm, with a gentleness that had become increasingly common between them. You impressed Graves today, he told her, as they walked to their waiting carriage. He's not a man easily impressed. I merely noticed what was there to be seen, she demurred. No, Alexander contradicted her. You saw what others missed, myself included. It's a valuable quality. He helped her into the carriage before continuing. Eleanor, I've been considering something for some time now. I believe you should have your own independent allowance, a significant one, to use as you see fit. She looked at him in surprise. That's very generous, but is it necessary? You've never denied me anything I've requested. It's not about necessity, he explained. It's about independence. My mother maintained her own account separate from the ducal finances. It gave her freedom to pursue her interests without oversight or explanation. What sorts of interests did she pursue? Eleanor asked, curious about this woman she would never meet, but whose pearl still hung around her neck. A rare smile touched Alexander's lips, causes that would have scandalized the more conservative members of society. Education for women, assistance for unwed mothers, support for wounded veterans after the Napoleonic Wars. His expression grew thoughtful. My father didn't always agree with her choices, but he respected her right to make them. Eleanor was deeply moved by this glimpse into his parents' relationship, a true partnership of equals, despite the vast power differential their positions might have suggested. I would be honored to follow in her footsteps, she said softly. Good. Alexander's tone became businesslike again. I'll have the necessary documents prepared. You should have access to the funds by the end of the week. As the carriage rolled through London's busy streets, Eleanor studied her husband's profile. The stern, forbidding Duke of Thornfield that society feared seemed increasingly remote from the man she was coming to know, a man of principle and surprising thoughtfulness, who valued her mind as well as her position as his Duchess. That evening, a messenger delivered a sealed note to Thornfield House. Alexander read it with grim satisfaction before passing it to Eleanor. Blackwood has withdrawn his allegations, he informed her. Apparently, the prospect of financial ruin was sufficient motivation for honesty. Eleanor scanned the brief, formally worded retraction. He must have been desperate indeed to capitulate so quickly. Desperation makes men dangerous, Alexander warned. I doubt we've seen the last of Thomas Blackwood, but for now at least, this particular threat is neutralized. As winter descended upon London, Eleanor found her days filled with a pleasant routine. She managed the Thornfield households with increasing confidence, continued her writing with Alexander's encouragement, and established herself as a respected hostess among the ton. Their relationship had settled into comfortable companionship, warmer than mere friendship, but still constrained by the boundaries Alexander maintained. Each night, He escorted her to the foot of the staircase, sometimes kissing her hand or forehead before they retired to their separate chambers. Eleanor treasured these moments of connection, even as she increasingly yearned for more. She had come to realize, with both surprise and certainty, that she had fallen in love with her husband, not with the Duke of Thornfield that society saw, but with Alexander, the complex, honorable man behind the title. Whether he returned her feelings remained uncertain. His behavior toward her had undoubtedly softened over the months of their marriage. He sought her opinion on matters both trivial and significant, included her in aspects of the dukedom that duchesses traditionally had no part in, and occasionally revealed glimpses of vulnerability that she suspected few others had ever witnessed. Yet he maintained a certain reserve, as though unwilling or unable to cross the final barriers between them. One snowy December evening, as they sat reading by the library fire after dinner, Alexander closed his book with uncharacteristic abruptness. "The annual Thornfield Christmas gathering at the court begins next week," he announced. "It's a tradition dating back generations. Family members and select friends spend the 12 days of Christmas at the estate." "How wonderful," Eleanor said, setting aside her own reading. "I didn't realize you maintained such traditions." "I nearly abandoned it after Caroline died," he admitted. "But my aunt, Lady Helena, insisted it continue. She argued that traditions provide continuity through difficult times." He paused, studying the fire rather than meeting Eleanor's eyes. "I should warn you that certain relatives can be challenging." Eleanor smiled at his diplomatic phrasing. "I look forward to meeting them all, challenging or otherwise." "When shall we depart for Derbyshire?" she asked, already mentally preparing for the journey. "Day after tomorrow, if that suits you," Alexander replied. "We should arrive well before the first guests to allow you time to familiarize yourself with the arrangements." The journey to Thornfield Court was considerably more pleasant than their previous trip, despite the winter weather. Eleanor found herself increasingly comfortable in Alexander's company, their conversations flowing easily as the carriage rolled through snow-dusted countryside. By the time they arrived at the estate, a sense of homecoming swept over Eleanor. This ancient house already felt more like home than her parents' London residence ever had. Mrs. Hadley had prepared the house beautifully for Christmas, with evergreen boughs adorning the main hall and mistletoe hanging strategically in doorways. The scent of pine and spices permeated the air, mingling with the wood smoke from crackling fireplaces. Alexander gave Eleanor a comprehensive tour of the public rooms, explaining the traditions associated with each space during the Christmas festivities. "The Great Hall is used for the Christmas Eve feast and the 12th night celebration," he informed her, as they stood in the magnificent space with its soaring ceiling and massive fireplace. "The Yule log will be brought in with some ceremony on the 23rd. It's quite the spectacle. The estate workers sing traditional carols as they carry it in." "It sounds magical," Eleanor said, picturing the scene. "Who will be attending this year?" "My Aunt Helena, Lady Westmoreland, and her husband, of course. She's my father's sister, and the family matriarch since my mother's passing." Alexander's expression suggested a mixture of respect and wariness. "My cousin Robert and his wife, Georgiana, various more distant relatives, and I've invited your aunt and Uncle Harrington as well, thinking you might appreciate familiar faces." "How thoughtful," she said warmly. "I look forward to it all." The first guests arrived 3 days later, the formidable Lady Helena Westmoreland and her considerably milder husband, Lord James. Lady Helena was a tall, silver-haired woman with the same grey eyes as Alexander, though hers held a sharpness that bordered on suspicion as she assessed Eleanor. "So you're the new Duchess," she declared without preamble after the initial greetings had been exchanged. "A most unusual circumstance, your marriage. Most unusual indeed." "Aunt Helena," Alexander warned quietly. The older woman waved away his concern. "Oh, don't bristle so, Alexander. I'm merely stating facts. I've no objection to unexpected marriages. My own was quite the scandal in its day." She turned her penetrating gaze back to Eleanor. "The question is whether you're equal to the position you've acquired, my dear." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "That, Lady Westmoreland, is something I strive to prove every day. The Thornfield name and legacy deserve no less." Lady Helena's eyebrows rose slightly, and something that might have been approval flickered in her expression. "Well said. We shall see how you manage the festivities. Caroline found them quite overwhelming, as I recall." Alexander stiffened beside Eleanor, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. "I'm fortunate to have excellent guidance from Mrs. Hadley and His Grace," she replied smoothly, "and I welcome any insights you might care to share from your years of experience." This deferential but confident response seemed to satisfy Lady Helena, who nodded briskly before allowing a footman to show her to her chambers. Lord James lingered to offer Eleanor a sympathetic smile. "Don't mind Helena's manner," he advised quietly. Her bark has always been worse than her bite. She merely wishes to ensure the Thornfield traditions are maintained properly. As the remaining guests arrived over the following days, Eleanor found herself navigating a complex web of family dynamics and expectations. Alexander's cousin Robert proved to be a jovial, good-natured man who clearly admired his more serious relative, while Robert's wife Georgiana was a quiet, bookish woman who bonded with Eleanor over their shared love of literature. Other, more distant relatives ranged from cordial to coolly polite, each observing the new Duchess with varying degrees of curiosity. The arrival of Lord and Lady Harrington brought Eleanor welcome support, as her aunt deftly maneuvered through the social currents, establishing her niece's position with subtle but effective interventions. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, Eleanor felt she had made substantial progress in winning over the Thornfield clan. The Christmas Eve feast was a magnificent affair, with the great hall transformed by candlelight and festive decorations. Eleanor, seated beside Alexander at the head of the long table, surveyed the gathering with quiet satisfaction. The traditional dishes had been prepared to perfection. The wine flowed freely, and even Lady Helena had unbent enough to compliment the arrangements. After dinner, the party retired to the music room, where family tradition dictated an evening of carols and performances. Various relatives displayed their talents. Georgiana played the pianoforte beautifully, while Robert had a surprisingly fine baritone voice. When it came to Eleanor's turn, she rose gracefully and moved to the pianoforte. "If I may, I would like to share a piece that my mother taught me," she said, settling her skirts around her on the bench. "It's a traditional carol, but perhaps not one you hear often." Her fingers moved confidently over the keys as she began a hauntingly beautiful arrangement of The Holly and the Ivy. When she began to sing, her clear soprano filling the room with pure, sweet notes, she was aware of Alexander watching her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of wonder and something deeper that made her heart race. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of hushed silence before enthusiastic applause broke out among the guests. Lady Helena nodded approvingly, and Eleanor's aunt dabbed discreetly at her eyes. "Beautifully done, my dear," Lady Harrington whispered, as Eleanor returned to her seat. "You've quite enchanted them all." Eleanor glanced at Alexander, who was still watching her with that same intense expression. "Not all of them matter equally," she murmured in response. Later that evening, as the guests gradually retired to their chambers, Eleanor found herself momentarily alone in the gallery, a long room lined with family portraits dating back centuries. She stood before a painting of Alexander's parents, the 6th Duke of Thornfield and his Duchess, studying the faces of these people who had shaped the man she had come to love. "They would have approved of you," Alexander's voice came from behind her. "Especially my mother." Eleanor turned to find him watching her, his tall figure silhouetted against the doorway. "I hope I would have liked them as well," she replied. Without question, he moved to stand beside her, looking up at his parents' portrait. "You share my mother's spirit, her independence of mind, her quiet determination." He turned to face her. "You were magnificent tonight, Eleanor. The entire family is thoroughly charmed. Even the formidable Lady Helena?" she asked with a small smile. "Especially Aunt Helena. She confided to me that you're a vast improvement over that fragile creature, Caroline, who never could hold her own in family gatherings." He grimaced slightly. Not the most tactful assessment, but high praise from her nonetheless. Eleanor hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind throughout the evening. "And you, Alexander? Am I an improvement in your estimation as well?" Something shifted in his expression, the careful control he maintained giving way to raw emotion. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and intense, "you are incomparable. I could not have imagined a more perfect Duchess for Thornfield, or a more perfect wife for myself." Her breath caught at this unprecedented admission. "Alexander, I have not been fair to you," he continued, taking her hands in his. "I married you offering respect and security, but maintaining distance out of fear that I would fail you as I failed Caroline, fear that I was incapable of being the husband you deserve. You have never failed me," Eleanor assured him earnestly. "No, but I have denied us both the chance for true happiness." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "Watching you tonight, seeing how naturally you've assumed your place in this family, how effortlessly you've won over even the most difficult relatives, I realized I can no longer hide behind my past." Heart pounding, Eleanor looked up into his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope, the question he was struggling to ask. "What are you saying, Alexander?" she whispered, needing to hear the words. "I'm saying that I love you, Eleanor," he said simply. "I believe I have loved you since that day at your aunt's literary salon, when you argued so passionately about women's education that you silenced every man in the room. I tried to fight it, to maintain the practical arrangement we agreed upon, but I find I can no longer pretend my feelings are merely those of respect and admiration. Joy surged through Eleanor, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. I love you too, she confessed. I've loved you since Derbyshire, when you showed me the chapel and trusted me with your pain, perhaps even before that. Alexander's hands moved to cradle her face with infinite tenderness. I have no right to ask for your heart when I offered you only a title and security. You have every right, she countered. You gave me far more than you promised, Alexander. You gave me respect, trust, freedom, gifts more precious than any title. Eleanor, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. My Eleanor. Then he was kissing her, his lips claiming hers with a passion that had been contained for too long. Eleanor melted into his embrace, her arms winding around his neck as she returned his kiss with equal fervor. All the longing, all the unspoken desire of the past months poured out between them as they stood beneath the watchful eyes of his ancestors. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. Will you be my wife in truth, not just in name? He asked softly. Will you share my life, my bed, my future completely? Yes, she whispered without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. His arms tightened around her, and in that moment, Eleanor knew that the unconventional beginning of their marriage had led them precisely where they were meant to be. What had started as a rescue, an arrangement of convenience, had transformed into something profound and real, a love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight glinting off fresh snow that had fallen during the night. Eleanor woke in her chamber, momentarily disoriented until the memories of the previous evening flooded back. Alexander's declaration, their kisses, the promises exchanged before they had reluctantly parted to maintain propriety with a house full of guests. She dressed carefully for the traditional Christmas morning service in the family chapel, choosing a gown of deep crimson that complemented her coloring. As she fastened her mother's pearl necklace around her throat, a soft knock came at her door. Alexander stood on the threshold, magnificent in formal morning attire. His eyes warmed as they took in her appearance. "Happy Christmas, Duchess," he greeted her, the private smile they now shared touching his lips. "Happy Christmas, Duke," she returned, accepting his offered arm. As they proceeded down the grand staircase, Eleanor was aware of a subtle change in their public demeanor. Nothing inappropriate that would raise eyebrows among their guests, but a new ease between them, a harmony of movement and purpose that hadn't existed before. Lady Helena, sharp-eyed as always, noted it immediately, her knowing gaze following them as they joined the family gathering in the entrance hall. The Christmas service was beautiful, the small chapel adorned with holly and evergreens, candles glowing warmly in the early morning light. As the family took their places in the ancient pews, Eleanor felt Alexander's hand cover hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of their shared joy. The day unfolded in a series of traditional activities, the exchange of gifts, a sumptuous luncheon, games in the drawing room, and a walk through the snow-covered grounds for the hardier guests. Through it all, Eleanor moved with newfound confidence, secure in her position not just as the Duchess of Thornfield, but as the woman Alexander loved. That evening, after the other guests had retired, she stood in her chamber, dismissing Simpson with the explanation that she would prepare for bed herself. When a soft knock came at the connecting door to Alexander's rooms, a door that had remained firmly closed since their arrival at Thornfield Court, she crossed the room with steady steps to open it. Alexander stood there, having discarded his formal evening attire for a simple dressing gown. His expression as he looked at her held such tenderness that Eleanor's heart seemed to expand in her chest. "I wondered if you might join me by the fire," he said softly, offering his hand. "There is much I wish to say to you without the constraints of propriety we've maintained all day." Eleanor placed her hand in his without hesitation, allowing him to lead her into his chambers, the private domain of the Duke of Thornfield that was now opening to include her, not just as his Duchess but as his beloved wife. As the snow fell gently outside the windows and the fire cast golden light across the room, Alexander and Eleanor finally crossed the last boundaries between them, discovering together the deep, abiding joy that comes when a marriage of convenience transforms into a union of true minds, hearts, and souls. In the years that followed, the story of how the Duke of Thornfield had claimed the abandoned bride at the altar became something of a legend in London society. Some romantics whispered that he had loved her from afar for years, watching over her until the moment came when he could make her his own. Others, more cynically, suggested it had been a calculated move to secure a suitable duchess. Only Eleanor and Alexander knew the full truth, that what had begun as an impulsive rescue, a practical solution to mutual problems, had blossomed into a love story more profound than either could have imagined. As they stood together on the terrace of Thornfield Court on their 5th wedding anniversary, watching their young son and daughter playing in the gardens below, Eleanor leaned into her husband's embrace. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "That day at the church, when you stood and claimed me as your own?" Alexander turned her in his arms, his grey eyes holding the warmth that now only she and their children ever saw fully. "It's not for a single moment," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. "That day I thought I was simply gaining a duchess. Instead I found my heart, my joy, my Eleanor." As his lips met hers in a kiss that still held all the passion of their first embrace, Eleanor silently thanked Thomas Blackwood for his cruelty and Providence for its wisdom. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest blessings come disguised as our darkest moments, and the most beautiful love stories begin not with love at first sight, but with honor, respect, and the courage to open one's heart when least expected. What most touched or surprised you in this story? If you enjoyed this emotional Victorian romance, please like, subscribe, and share with others who appreciate tales of love that defy society's expectations. Thank you for listening, and watch for another equally moving video appearing on your screen now.